I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to be with Jody and I as we share this work with you that we have been collaborating on for the last 15 years. When I met Jody at the University of Florida, look at Elena. That's another University of Florida. Alumni. We're Gators, go Gators. we got Simon here, he's a Gator too. Go Gator. He's an unhappy Gator. A Gator nonetheless. We have a few Gators here. So 15 years ago, somewhere thereabout, Jody was doing a work at the University of Florida. She had just begun working on her master's degree in art history, and she was at a place of a hiccup. We know about hiccups. So my advisor, who was Jody's advisor, recommended that Jody come and meet Adeo Funian. And she took his recommendation and she came to my house. I lived in a little cottage on a lake in a far off and distant place. But she found her way to me. And Jody and I sat on the porch and we talked and we talked and we talked. And I would always say to Jody, let me tell you a story. And we would talk and talk and talk and talk for hours. And so I recommended some work that Jody might find interesting that she could do her thesis on. And so she wrote her thesis on Yao Owusu, Shango Owusu, who was a blacksmith in my grandfather's shop, along with me when I was apprenticing. And her thesis is an award winner. It was so stellar. So Jody and I have been collaborating on projects since. And a story that I like to tell also is Jody's grandmother came to visit Jody, and we all went out to lunch, and she looked at me and she says, take care of my granddaughter. And I've been doing it ever since. But the good news is Jody now has a husband, a loving husband, and so her mother and I are almost relieved of that duty, yeah. But it's been both an honor and a pleasure to work with and to serve with Jody. So Jody asked me to read a story in opening this talk, and I think it's so appropriate. So the story is titled The Wondrous Powers, Mirror, Sandals, and Medicine Bag. An old man had 3 children, all boys. When they had grown up to manhood, he called them together and told them that now he was very old and no longer able to provide, even for himself. He ordered them to go out and bring him food and clothing. The 3 brothers set out, and after a very long while, they came to a large river. As they had gone on together for such a time, they decided that once they got across, they would separate. The eldest told the youngest to take the middle road, and the second to go to the right, while he himself would go to the left. Then in a year's time, they would come back to the same spot. So they parted, and at the end of a year, as agreed, they found their way back to the riverside. The eldest asked the youngest what he had gotten during his travels, and the boy replied, I have nothing but a mirror, but it has a wonderful power. If you look into it, you can see all over the country, no matter how far away. When asked in turn what he had gotten, the second brother replied, only a pair of sandals that are so full of power that if one puts them on, one can walk at once to any place in the country in one step. Then the eldest said, I too have obtained but little, a small calabash of medicine. That is all. But let us look into the mirror and see how Father fares, how Father is doing. The youngest produced his mirror, and they all looked into it and saw that their father was already dead, and that even the funeral custom was finished. Then the eldest said, "Let us hasten home and see what we can do." So the second brought out his sandals, and all three placed their feet inside them, and immediately they were home to their father's grave. Then the eldest shook the medicine bag out of his bag and poured it on the grave. At once their father arose, as if nothing had been the matter with him. I asked the question, now which of these three sons has performed the best? I leave you with that. Jody Berman.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Ade, for such a warm welcome. And it's so important to me that we're doing, that I'm able to do this presentation in Charleston, because so much of my research that I was doing in Florida actually has to do with Charleston. Is that better? Okay. So I'm very honored to be able to talk about this in such a historic place, but also a place of such importance to my research. Okay, so I'll begin. Yao Owusu Shangofemi has been practicing the art of blacksmithing for over 25 years. Yao officially began his exploration of the blacksmith trade in 1976 when he apprenticed himself to Philip Simmons, the Charleston blacksmith, who remains one of the most revered blacksmiths in America today. Yao has also studied the African religion, art, and traditions of both the Akan and the Yoruba, and he continues to embrace these cultures in order to reclaim the African heritage of his ancestry. Yao's participation and interest in African culture has added ramifications when one considers the fact that through the Middle Passage of the African slave trade, there exists the likelihood of an African blacksmithing tradition that has survived in the diaspora. As one scholar has pointed out, quote, "Once we understand that blacks were commonly employed in the metal trade, that in some places they dominated the smithing craft, we can recognize that the potential existed for an Afro-American tradition in blacksmithing." In order to allow for a more accurate and complete appreciation of Yao's experience as a blacksmith, I will discuss Yao's blacksmithing career as an episode within the larger framework of the history of iron smelting and iron working in the African and African American traditions. Okay? And we have his work upstairs for you to see after. So, Yao Owusu Shangofemi was born as Paul Burns Jr. on January 1st, 1947 in Brooklyn, New York. In the 60s, Yao was still living in New York when he became involved with the civil rights movement. The era was marked by extreme social unrest. An unprecedented amount of energy had formed against the second-class citizenships accorded to African Americans. Also during that time period in Africa, Ghana was liberated from the British Mandate. Ghana's independence had unleashed considerable sentiment among American blacks who over the years had maintained a sentimental, if not vocal, interest in the affairs of blacks on the African continent. As a result of this awareness, an interest in Ghanaian culture and religion developed, and avenues for this interest were established. For example, an Akan temple in Queens, New York was founded in 1967. Yao became involved in the Ghanaian Akan religion through this Akan temple. It was through his involvement in the Akan temple that his name was changed from Paul Burns Jr. to Yao Owusu. The name Yao indicates he was born on a Thursday. Owusu signifies noble, and the Ghanaian culture continues to influence his daily life. In 1967, Yao moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where he obtained work welding in a shipyard. While in Charleston, he was introduced to Kareem Abdul. Kareem and Yao soon became friends, and when Kareem witnessed Yao's talent for welding, he suggested that he go see the blacksmith, Philip Simmons. So, many people know Philip Simmons or his work. Philip Simmons began practicing the art of blacksmithing at the age of 13. Philip Simmons' personhood and artistic career have been popularized by the historic Charleston Foundation as a bridge between the antebellum customs of ironworking and South Carolina's African heritage tradition. South Carolina has long been recognized as a state associated with an African or slave-related past. South Carolina became the first state to have a slaveholding majority in its white population. You can see here on this map. During the 18th century, the majority of the population in South Carolina were slaves, and by 1850, the growth of the plantation slavery had, quote, converted the state into one gigantic black belt, end quote. The fact that South Carolina was so heavily dependent on the labor of these enslaved Africans has laid the groundwork for an African or African American tradition in the arts and culture of the region. Although the enslaved persons easily assimilated many aspects of New World culture, they did not abandon their artistic cultural heritage in the diaspora. The slaves of South Carolina labored for 3 centuries, often in considerable isolation, both on large plantations and in villages, as well as separated on the sea islands off the coast. The Sea Islands have been regarded as the most purely African of all African American areas in the country. The African-derived customs of these people have been able to flourish primarily because of the reduced interference of the whites in comparison to other areas of the United States. Philip Simmons was Gullah Geechee. He grew up on Daniel Island, a sea island across from the Cooper River. Philip Simmons began his formal interest in blacksmith work when he, like Yao, momentously witnessed the activity of a blacksmith shop. Philip was enraptured as the blacksmith Peter Simmons and his apprentices created an iron hinge. Okay, so that's Peter Simmons. Apparently, Peter Simmons was quite well known in East Charleston for his ability to fix anything. Master blacksmith Peter Simmons had spent his early childhood in slavery and grew up during the Reconstruction era. He had learned his trade from his father, Guy Simmons, who had worked as a plantation blacksmith. The early practice of slaves hiring themselves out as skilled craftsmen had been a common occurrence in Charleston for decades. The profits earned through these arrangements were split between the enslaved person and his master. The economic outcome of this practice led to some resentment among the white workers, since blacks accepted extremely low wages and thus undercut the open labor market. In fact, records indicate that a nearly complete parity was achieved between black and white smiths in Charleston history. Therefore, since blacks were employed in the metal trades, that in some places they dominated the smithing craft, it seems obvious that the potential existed for an Afro-American tradition in blacksmithing. Babatunde Lawal, a leading researcher in the field of African art, commented on the African retentions in the diaspora when he wrote, quote, African American art is, as it were, a tree with African roots and American branches. The cuttings were transplanted from Africa at the inception of the slave trade. Although North America has transformed the tree to the extent that its Africanity is not readily apparent today, the roots are still spiritually attached to the motherland through African retentions and continuities in physique, behavior, disposition, dress, linguistics, aesthetics, religion, burial customs, folklore, poetry, music, and dance. Since records have indicated that scores of the captured African-born slaves were master artisans in their homelands, it is not unimaginable that they created New World objects through the scope of the Old. Though they may have easily adapted to many aspects of Western culture, they did not abandon their artistic heritage upon arrival in the United States. While new European blacksmithing techniques were introduced in the diaspora and resulting adjustments were made to satisfy tastes, the combination of African and Native American elements with the European model is resultantly undeniable. Philip began as an apprentice to Peter Simmons, working his way up to being his partner and eventually taking over the shop altogether. Today, Philip's work are part of the Smithsonian collection, are exhibited in the South Carolina State Museum, and he himself was considered to be a national treasure by the Smithsonian Institution. By the time Philip Simmons first stood at Peter Simmons' door, and then when Yao stood at Philip Simmons' door, blacksmithing had been an African American tradition in Charleston for over 200 years. Yao began his pursuit as Philip had earlier, by visiting the blacksmith shop daily. Yao initiated his attention in the blacksmith shop by watching the work, noting how Philip and apprentices Ronnie Pringle, Silas Sessions, and Carlton Simmels manipulated the iron, forming different shapes and designs with each coal heating and with each firm bang of the hammer. While Yao was in Charleston, he became acquainted with Philip Simmons' grandson, Ade Afunien. We know this guy. Ade had joined his grandfather's shop as a blacksmithing apprentice. The circumstances that Yao and Ade shared allowed them to become closer friends and eventually led to their becoming business partners when they created a blacksmithing shop of their own to work out of. They named their business the Charleston Blacksmiths, after the book by John Black that recounted Philip Simmons' career. Even their business cards featured their celebrated mentor, while Yao and Ade had established their own blacksmithing business. They never dissociated themselves from Philip Simmons' shop. Ade and Yao acknowledged that Philip continued to serve as their mentor, and he was always available to instruct them. Yao once said of his connection to Philip's shop and of the stylistic similarities of their work, "You know, when the blacksmiths work in the same shop, their signature is the way that they do things. Like if you look at the way that we make our scrolls, you would know what shop it came from, because Philip makes his scrolls different than any other blacksmith shop that I'd seen, because everyone does it different. Like the pecan leaf design is Philip's design. It's akin to that shop, and the way the scrolls are tucked, that's the main thing." Ade added, "It's Philip's signature, but we have the authority to sign it. It came out of his shop." Several stylistic references to Philip Simmons' shop can be observed within the opus of Yao's ironwork designs. The scroll design that Yao spoke of as the main thing, that indicates a technique originating in Philip's shop, and it's observable in much of Yao's ironwork. For example, the scroll motif arising in Yao's ironwork is observable in a large gate that Yao created for a home on Wentworth Street in downtown Charleston. This gate is particularly comparable to a gate that Philip's shop created for a driveway on Maury Boulevard. While there are definite differences between the two gates, the similarities are more numerous and signify the stylistic influence that Yao has received from his apprenticeship in Philip Simmons' shop. A further example of the affinities with Philip's shop and that Yao preserves in his work is the David Star Gate. This gate is similar to Philip's Star and Fish Gate in several respects. Compositionally, they both include a star from the form in the upper center quadrant. Philip has included a small 5-pointed star within a larger 5-pointed star. So this is Philip's, and that's Yao's, in case you can see it. Reminiscent of the star of the American flag. Yao has included the 6-pointed Star of David, an image that came to him in a dream. On the flanking panels of the David Star Gate, Yao has incorporated the pecan leaf design that he routinely attributed to Philip's influence. Moreover, Yao has included a Charleston circle in the lower center quadrant of the gate that correlates to the circle around the 5-pointed star in Philip's design. Compositionally, they are very close, with only minor variations within the designs. And it can be, the David Star Gate can be understood as an homage to Philip Simmons' methodology and a reflection of Yao's consummate imagination. One further experience that Yao and Ade share in South Carolina was their participation in Oyotunji Village. Oyotunji is a community of African Americans who established an independent African society to recreate Yoruba culture in the United States. Walter King founded the village in the 1970s. He is the original leader of the movement and maintained his role as the Oba, or King of Oyotunji African Village, until his death in 2005. Participants at Oyotunji Village observe the Yoruba religion, attempt to live a Yoruba lifestyle, and carry out African cultural practices. Yao became a member of the society in 1976 and eventually moved to Oyotunji Village while continuing his blacksmithing and shipyard work. He remained there for 2 years. It was during this time he spent in Oyotunji that Yaowusu became Yaowusu Shango Femi. Shango Femi can be interpreted as Shango loves me. Shango is the Yoruba Orisha, or deity of thunder. His full name, Yao Owusu Shangofemi, denotes the synchronistic nature of African religious practice in the United States. Both the Akan and Yoruba religions influence his life and his artwork. For example, Amiri Baraka, a black nationalist poet, commented on this occurrence when he stated, "The African cultures, the retention of some parts of these cultures in America, and the weight of the steppe culture produce the American Negro, a new race. I want to use music as my persistent reference, just because the development and transmutation of African music to American Negro music, a new music, represent to me this whole process in microcosm." Yao experiences in Oyotunji village and within the Akan community have influenced his life and consequently his artwork. His deliberate inclusion of African subject matter has become a feature within his artwork, and it differentiates his work from that of his mentor, Philip Simmons. Yao actively cultivates African themes in his artwork, whereas Philip's artistry seemed to suggest it only passively at best. While one cannot divorce a person from their cultural heritage, Yao has purposefully sought connection to his African heritage in ways that Philip Simmons has not. Ade Ofuniyin once commented on this differentiation when he said, "Yao has the ability to be a better artist than my grandfather because he has the fifth element, the spiritual." The Gullah, or Women's Society, in Oyotunji village once commissioned Yao to create a functional piece of artwork for use during anointing ceremonies. For them, Yao created a life-size buzzard with its wings outstretched, perched on a staff over 6 feet in the air. Birds have been a common symbol that alludes to the women in a ritually transformed state. In Yoruba belief, women, especially elderly women, possess extraordinary powers equal to or greater than that of the gods and the ancestors. It is believed that womankind can bring prosperity, health, and fertility to the land and its people, or they can bring destruction, epidemic, drought, and pestilence. This understanding of womankind is reflected in various praises that refer to them as, quote, our mothers, the gods of society, the owners of the world. To create the bird, Yao used several resources. He had stated, quote, "I studied the way the vultures fly, how they spread their wings. There's one right there," he points to the sky. "Yeah, we're talking about you." Yao has avowed that during the process of creating the large sculpture, live vultures were constantly and inexplicably surrounding his shop. He observed, "When I was making the turkey vulture, vultures came from all over and sit up in the trees while I was making it. They act like they were my models. One came out here one day and Ade said, 'Look at him up there in that tree with his wings outstretched.' He was saying, 'This is how the wings should go, stretched like this.' Then we saw one day about 7 or 8 of them gathered in the tree behind us and sat in that tree. We said, 'They must know what's going on here in the shop.'" One similarity that Yao and Philip Simmons seem to share is their source for inspiration. Both Yao and Philip have claimed to receive ideas for their designs in supernatural ways. Yao said of Philip, "You know, Philip dreams. You know, a lot of the designs he does, he'll say he is going to sleep on it. He sleep on it and then he comes the next day, or a few days later, he will give you his design." During the creation of the vulture, Yao often stated that ideas were coming to him in dreams as well. This organic way of creating art has been a characteristic that Yao has always had in common with his mentor, Philip Simmons. This phenomenon can be understood as a connection to their ethnic heritage because countless African and African American artisans have claimed to receive their inspiration through spiritual or supernatural manners. One example of this phenomenon is apparent among the Gullah of Liberia. They believe that an artist's spiritual guardian, or Jina, supplies him with the ability, or neme, to create a good mask or statue. The Gullah community even routinely characterizes the sculptor as a dreamer. Hence, by receiving inspiration from their artwork through visions and dreams, Philip and Yao are not only united to other African American artists, but to traditional African artists as well. The vulture sculpture stands in front of the Yemaya shrine in Oyotunji village. It is utilized during the Gullah ceremonies when the ashe imbued matter is placed in the small bowl underneath the bird and procured for anointing purposes during the ritualized ceremony. Yao has also produced other ceremonial artworks that include bird imagery, specifically sculptural forms that symbolically refer to the orisha of herbalist medicine, Osain, such as the one displayed in this exhibition upstairs. The survival of the Orisha, Osain in the diaspora, is essential to Yoruba religious practice because each of the deities are served by their own particular herbs taken with permission from the realm of Osain. Yet for all this herbalist Orisha's glory, the image is physically peculiar. He is said to have one leg, one arm, and one eye, which are the physical consequences of an egocentric and wanton existence. It is also believed that Osain failed to make a proper sacrifice commanded by divination and consequently lost his voice. From that point onward, whenever Osain opened his mouth to speak, only a high-pitched, squeaky voice resonated from his lips. These physical abnormalities have given the deity insight into the perils of the human condition. The imagery that has been associated alludes to his physical condition. For instance, certain groups in Nigeria claim that the sound of his voice relates to a little bird that represents him. This explanation would account for the myriad of wrought iron staffs surmounted by bird imagery that are created for the province of Osain. An additional reason given for the inclusion of bird imagery relates to the realm of witchcraft. The herbalist struggles against witchcraft since it is believed to be the magical source of human pathology. It is believed that witches transform themselves into night birds and thus are representative of such on the staffs of Osain. Many Yoruba myths concern birds and relate tales of a bird witch in the night that stealthily preys on unsuspecting victims. It is believed that during these night visits, the bird witch, quote, pecks the head of the sleeping target to suck out blood, causing illness, death, or to eat the spirit of the individual. In order to be protected from these night visits, some adherents would place a staff in the corner of the room or next to their bed. They would shake the staff each evening and rattle the bells so that the evil spirits will not come. Interestingly, a similar tradition is found among the Gullah people of the Sea Islands of South Carolina. Many African Americans of the Sea Islands have a belief that the spirit of a dead or dying older woman may become a hag or an old woman who practices witchcraft, quote, and bears a grudge against one of her neighbors. Like the witch in the Yoruba belief system, it is during the night that she completes her malicious work, and if the witch's activities are brought into the light of day, they lose their potency. Also, as previously stated, the Yoruba have the tradition of placing a diviner's staff in the bedroom to protect them from the night witches. In the Gullah tradition, the protective place object is the house broom. Interestingly, they both have a similar overall shape. Thus, it is not inconceivable that African beliefs could have been the source for the Gullah belief of the night hag or witch, although it may or may not be specifically Yoruba. Whether it be in the curve of his scroll design or the purpose of a Yoruba herbalist Osain staff, Yao actively draws inspiration from his experiences to create objects of artistry that exemplify diaspora art. Through the creation of ironwork designs, Yao maintains the African American blacksmithing tradition imparted to him through Philip Simmons, who followed Peter Simmons, who in turn learned from his father, Guy Simmons. As Yao embraces the teachings of this African American blacksmithing lineage, he also reaches beyond those generations to seek a more African blacksmithing tradition in his devotion to Ogun, a roots heritage of ironworking, as it were. Yao commented on this concept when he stated, quote, "What I realized in a lot of the designs in Charleston and different places are that a lot of them are African motifs. Somebody saw the motif and designed it, but nobody else knew that it was an old African design." These survivals in the African and African American blacksmithing tradition are reflected of the inexorable communal will of the people. When Philip Simmons once expressed uncertainty to his mentor Peter Simmons that he was concerned about the future of their blacksmithing trade, he was simply told, "Boy, don't worry about it. There will always be work for a blacksmith. Don't worry about it." To date, Peter's reassuring words have not been entirely contradicted. With the advancements of the Industrial Revolution and all that came with the conveniences of mass production, the blacksmith remains a part of the skilled convergence. His skill is both practical and evolutionary in nature. As long as metals are employed by civilization, the blacksmith will remain a notable member of society. However, that is not to say that the role of the blacksmith has not changed. For example, in the past, the blacksmith work was a trade that was imperative to the formation of metalwork. Nowadays, with the advent of mass production, the role of the blacksmith has been decidedly less essential to society, and thus the perception of ironwork has also changed. Philip Simmons' ironwork is no longer viewed as exclusively utilitarian. It has been recognized as sculpture, and it is situated in prominent art collections such as the Smithsonian Institution and the State of South Carolina Museum. The inclusion of ironwork in art collections has opened up the arena for it to be reconsidered in terms of aesthetic value, inventiveness, and tradition. Yet while our understanding of ironwork has developed in new areas, the nature of the work of the blacksmith has remained the same. Thus, one must ask whether our consideration of a work affects the work itself. I would venture to say not. Regardless of our determination of the ironwork as art or sculpture, the ironwork itself remains traditional entirely. The classification is conventional as per the time period, but the trade itself is time-honored and evocative of an African precedent. As Philip Simmons, the most widely revered African-American blacksmith in the United States, has stated, "I build a gate, and I just be thinking about 200 years. If you don't, you're not an honest craftsman."
Thank you so much. Yeah. So, art and scholarship, they go hand in hand. Art and research, scholarship, they go hand in hand. I just want to say that your presence, all of you here this afternoon, is demonstrative of the power of art to draw out those people in the community. If you look around, you'll see the diversity of our community of Charleston. Age, gender, ethnicity, the diversity of our community in Charleston. Something that we strive for. It's through art. I present this art not for art's sake, but as a means to bring us out so that we can engage a conversation that includes art, but more broadly, that speaks to our humanity and our need to be together, to assemble, so that we can get at some of these things that we need to get at to inspire us, to comfort us, to heal us. All things that we need here in Charleston, the state, the country, the world. So this presentation is in two parts. Jody, and then I'm going to do a talk. But to accommodate the talk that I'm going to do, we're going to need to shift the chairs so that we're facing that wall over there where the projection is. And my daughter commented that, "Baba, that might be a difficult task. You might lose some people." I assured her that most of us in here are adults and are quite capable of moving chairs from one side of the room to the other and being seated so that we can continue to engage. Am I right about that? We can do that. Yes. Yeah. But before we do that, I would like to invite our mayor, John Tecklenburg, to come forward, and I want us as a community to note that when the community is having something, particularly those of us in the arts community, a community that's oftentimes overlooked, a community that's oftentimes under-resourced, but a community that that serves as a reason for Charleston, a damn good reason. Mayor Tecklenburg, he shows up with his gracious wife, Sandy. They show up together. And so I asked him to say a few words to us. So, Mayor Tecklenburg.
Well, thank you, Dr. O, and thank you, Jody, as well, for this wonderful presentation and exhibit of 16 candles that you crowns.
We could have done candles, but we did crowns.
And thanks to Ann Quattlebaum and Scott Watson with the city who help us put on events and just exhibits here. Isn't this a beautiful facility that the city has? I mean, I got to tell you, I'm all for using it more, like we did with the poetry of our new poet laureate, Marcus Amaker, and this experience today. So I briefly, a couple of these may seem disjointed thoughts, but one expression I remember when I was a little kid, I guess it was maybe my dad that would say it sometimes when he was, explaining to people from off, what it was like to be a Charlestonian, be from here, and maybe it was somewhat of a joke. He would say, we Charlestonians are like the Chinese because we worship our ancestors and we eat rice every day. And I always thought that was kind of cute. And what I've come to recognize in more of my adult life is that we do honor our ancestors, and part of that realization for me has come from knowing Dr. O, that we respect our elders and that we honor our ancestors, and that's a great African tradition, as well as my dad always used to like to talk about, his family as well. And even though as a kid my mom cooked rice all the time, I didn't really realize the import of rice to this culture and to the whole colonial America. And I told this story just a little while ago. We were at the Gullah gathering over the Maritime Center, but in just 15 years after the colony was founded, a sea captain from Madagascar brought a bag full of rice seed to Charleston, and a planter tried it, and within about 10 years we were producing a mere 10,000 pounds of rice a year. That would have been in the late 1690s. Well, by the 1720s we were producing 20 million pounds of rice for export from the city of Charleston. And it was developed with the knowledge and on the backs of enslaved Africans who were brought to this colony. And in many cases, they were sought after in parts of Africa where rice cultivation was known and was part of the culture. So, and again, this may seem disjointed. I love this facility. You can look out at the harbor, and that was our connection with the world. And since becoming mayor, I've had the blessing to encounter folks from around the world already. We're becoming more and more an international city. We're now recognized as being, at least by one travel magazine, as being the #1 quality destination in the world. I mean, we have some international credentials. So I got to tell you another thing. I've been a little worried about our national government, watching the presidential campaign this year. It's really a scary thing. And so as I've been going through, and I went to economic global conference in Greenville a couple of weeks ago, and the Swedish company Volvo is here, and our great Gullah African connections. I've decided that Charleston, the city of Charleston, needs its own State Department. And we reached that international stature that we need to do that. I don't know that I trust those folks in Washington anyway. So I'm here today to make a very important announcement. My very first appointment as an ambassador to the African diaspora, Dr. O.